Jehovah's Witnesses annual meeting is when they get new understandings on the Bible, meaning they make some changes to the religion and they pretend that God told them to make those changes. And this last annual meeting came with one of the biggest changes that this religion has had in the past 30 years.
Our ministry involves much more than counting time. For this reason, we are pleased to announce that beginning November the 1st, 2023, congregation publishers will no longer be asked to report the amount of time they spend in the ministry, nor will publishers be asked to report their placements, the videos they show, or their return visits. Instead, the field service report will simply have a box that will allow each publisher to indicate that he or she shared in any form of the ministry.
This is a huge change to the religion, breaking away from a requirement for Jehovah's Witnesses that's over a century old. So let's break down what happened and what that means for the religion. To do that, we have to remember why Jehovah's Witnesses started to count time in the first place. And that's something most Jehovah's Witnesses today don't even know about. Let's see how Jehovah's Witnesses tell that story nowadays.
When did we begin reporting field service activity? Prior to 1920, only coal porters, as pioneers were then called, were asked to submit reports. But beginning in 1920, everyone in the congregation who participated in the witness work was asked to turn in a weekly report.
This is everything they say about counting time because Jehovah's Witnesses don't like to admit to the fact that they used to sell publications. But that's how this religion originated. This religion started as a group of people publishing and selling books, converting others to also go out and sell books. That's why the video says that pioneers were called colporteurs, because that means someone who is a book peddler, someone who sells books, particularly religious books. This was over 100 years ago, and society looked very different. It was very normal to get people to knock on your doors to sell books, encyclopedias, vacuum cleaners, magazine subscriptions, and much more. Door-to-door canvassing was an effective way of selling things back then. So, obviously, if you have a whole bunch of volunteers in your religion that's based around selling books, you're going to get your followers to sell books door-to-door. If you look at the door-to-door preaching as the sales efforts that the religion relied upon to continue growing and surviving, it starts to make more sense when they say things like this.
Twice a year during the late 1920s, 1 week was designated for a special worldwide witnessing campaign. Pioneers had a goal of 40 hours for that special week. In January 1939, a suggestion was placed before congregation publishers, a goal of 60 hours per month. Early on, congregation field service reports were thorough.
They wanted people to spend as much time preaching door to door because the more time they spent doing that, the more books and magazines the religion would sell. That is also why report cards were so thorough, because it was a system to keep track of everyone's sales, figuring out what was selling better and how they were being sold. Report cards became almost your working spreadsheet that detailed how much you had worked for the religion and how many things you had sold for it. That's when the religion started to equate the time spent in the ministry as your spiritual health. The more time you spent selling books door to door, the more spiritual you were, because the more time you had spent generating revenue and looking for more recruits to generate revenue. As I explained in the door-to-door preaching work video that I did a few months ago, this all changed in 1990 when the Jehovah's Witnesses stopped selling publications door to door and instead decided to ask for donations in exchange for them as a way to avoid paying taxes. By then, the religion had experienced a slowdown on sales door to door as door to door salespeople started to become less and less common. This was a disastrous blow for printed publications, and they spent the next 15 years drastically reducing the amount of publications they made that now they couldn't sell. They had this group of people who were conditioned to expect spiritual food in the form of books and publications regularly. But for the first time in the history of the religion, now that didn't make any money. That's why, to keep them engaged, they switched to video material. Videos are far easier to produce and distribute, which was becoming very important as all expenses generated by printed media became a liability instead of an investment. But that left Jehovah's Witnesses going door to door to sell nothing. The Jehovah's Witnesses stopped generating money with the door-to-door preaching work in 1990. And all that remained from it was a system of control. Remember how they measured your spirituality based on how long you spent going door to door? That remained a vestigial practice, despite it no longer having a direct connection with it benefiting the religion. And that's what our accounting was for over 30 years. It remained exclusively as a system of control. For well over a couple of decades, Jehovah's Witnesses were still expected to spend a minimum of 10 hours per month on the field ministry, because by this point, preaching didn't mean talking about God with anybody. The religion had made preaching to exclusively mean talking about God to strangers. If they didn't spend 10 hours a month in the ministry, they weren't considered an active Jehovah's Witness and weren't counted towards the global number of Jehovah's Witnesses. But this all changed in the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic marked the very first time when Jehovah's Witnesses were told to not go door to door. How did they do it? Well, by changing it so the members were able to write letters to give to strangers later. But by now, preaching door to door had become completely useless, since Jehovah's Witnesses not only weren't selling books anymore, they weren't convincing people either. And by the end of the pandemic, most congregations struggled to go back to the preaching numbers they had before. People, for the very first time, had stopped doing this useless work, and they obviously didn't want to go back to doing it. This religion is struggling to get people back to the Kingdom Hall, let alone to preach. And the issue is that they had already tied their membership to their preaching. During the pandemic, they removed the 10-hour minimum to preach. Because before, remember, you needed to spend a minimum of 10 hours to do the preaching work to be considered an active Jehovah's Witness. But becoming inactive could have still been an accident, like someone not being able to spend enough time in the preaching work for whatever reason. Now, we don't have access to the numbers, but I am willing to bet that their hours are at an all-time minimum, which means their members must also be at an all-time minimum. This shift gets rid of this voluntary work that has been pointless for the religion since 1990, which, remember, is nothing but a vestigial practice from when they used to sell books. However, the mechanism of control remains there. The only thing they did was streamline the mechanism of control to adapt to the reality that fewer and fewer Jehovah's Witnesses are reporting fewer and fewer hours. That's why I don't buy people saying this is the religion trying to become more mainstream, because they got rid of the time requirement, sure, but they haven't gotten rid of the control mechanism. In fact, they've made it stronger. This makes it so it's no longer a passive thing to become inactive. On the contrary, this makes it so anyone who's fading from the organization to become brighter than ever. Because you have to be willing to say that you didn't tell anybody about Jehovah for even a little bit in the whole month to become inactive. Now, that is a conscious decision that you take, not just something that happened to you. There can be many excuses to not be able to go out to preach during the weekends, but there is no excuse to not even mention your religion to someone else in passing, which you're supposed to be doing all the time as a Jehovah's Witness. To me, this change is the governing body refusing to give up control while being unable to get Jehovah's Witnesses to go door to door. The governing body must have seen that the Jehovah's Witnesses are spending less and less time in the field ministry, but they refuse to give up their control mechanism. I personally think this is the governing body saying, fine, no more minimum hours to be a Jehovah's Witness, just say out loud you want to still be a witness, which will only make it harder for those who want to fade from the religion to stop being a Jehovah's Witness, while keeping in touch with their Jehovah's Witnesses family and friends. This isn't some convoluted plot to get the religion to be more normal. The religion still has every single marking of a high control group that it had before this announcement. On the contrary, on one move, the governing body has gotten rid of a practice that they haven't been able to profit from in the last 30 years, while avoiding showing the embarrassing preaching numbers and while reaffirming control over their followers, making it harder than ever to leave quietly. And I think this only proves what we already know, that this religion is bleeding members. When you're losing the game, you change the rules. And they've been changing the rules for the last 10 years to make it as easy as possible to maintain control over their followers, to apparently no avail because they keep changing things. And I think this also marks the beginning of the end to the door-to-door preaching work. Although pioneers and special pioneers still need to report time, they are about to become the only ones preaching. And most of them do their preaching nowadays standing up next to a cart, and not in the tiresome and pointless work of going door to door. This religion isn't becoming more mainstream. Don't let anybody tell you that. They still shun, they still sexually repress their followers, they still hide a whole bunch of abusers in their database. They're just simply making it easier to remain one of their members in an effort to keep them from leaving. Whereas before you had to spend a minimum amount of hours doing profitable work for the religion and be an expert on it to be able to confront random people door to door and explain your beliefs to them. Now, all you need to do is sit next to a card and tell anyone that if you have any questions, they can just go to jw.org. This doesn't benefit members. This just makes them more passive and mentally numb. Now, you shouldn't be disappointed with that read. Sure, this doesn't mean the religion is becoming more normal, but they're making it easier than ever to stay within this extremist cult because they're losing members. And the more time of the Jehovah's Witnesses have, the more time they'll have to think about their religion. And the better the chances of them waking up. This is a desperate attempt to try to maintain control over their followers. And they wouldn't be doing that if they weren't losing control over them. But let me know below, why do you think they got rid of the hourly requirement? How do you think this will impact the religion? I really can't wait to read your comment. I'll be releasing a full breakdown of the annual meeting in a few days, including more about the apologetics for this change and other very interesting changes they made to the religion, so subscribe if you don't want to miss that.